Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker.
I call Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I rise to speak in this third reading debate on the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Transitional Provisions Amendment Bill in the name of my friend and colleague Dr Nick Smith, the Minister of Environment, and I do so, sir, with great pleasure, because as Chairman of the Select Committee I was able to work diligently and carefully with other hard-working members on the committee, and we were able, I think, to do as the previous Speaker has just indicated, bring back to the House a better piece of legislation than the piece of legislation that was introduced at first reading. Now, sir, I'd like to just spend a minute both acknowledging and also, I guess, criticising to a degree the contribution of the immediate past Speaker. Dr Megan Woods is a valuable and diligent member of the committee, and she usually makes a very good and energetic contribution, as she has in the debate this afternoon, sir. But listening to her, one would have to think that actually some great, terrible misdeed has occurred here, when in fact, after 9 long years of her government's administration, there was simply nothing done to do anything to protect our exclusive economic zone by her predecessors. Now, I fully accept, sir, that that member wasn't in government or in Parliament during those 9 long years, and so has no personal responsibility, but for her to stand up and wax eloquent about the shortcomings of this government on legislation that has so well now protected our exclusive economic zone rings a little bit hollow and strikes a sharp tone, sir. Sir, energy is absolutely essential to every aspect of our modern daily life. We use energy in every sphere of human activity here in the country, from the north to the very deep south, and everybody is involved as an energy user in some shape or form. It's vital for our factories, our hospitals, for our transportation, for production of chemicals, fertilisers, for manufacturing, construction, travel, heating, cooking, and pretty much every aspect of our day-to-day lives. And we've been fortunate, sir, in New Zealand to have always had a secure source of energy, with the vast majority of our electricity being produced from renewables, but occasionally we require hydro to make up a shortfall when there has been a period of low rainfall. But back in the 1970s, due to the development work done on the Maui platform, we were fortunate as a nation to discover that we have significant oil and gas reserves off the coast of Taranaki. And so this bill provides the Shell Todd Oil Services organisation with continuity in allowing their operations that have been very successfully working off the coast at Taranaki now for nearly 50 years in a very sensible and safe way, I might add. It allows them to continue that process and to continue making a very significant contribution to the energy requirements and needs of us as a nation. Sir, a marine consent is required under the EEZ Act, and it's required to enable organisations such as Shell Todd to continue their extractive business. They have been doing that, as I said, for a long number of years now, based in that oil-rich region of Taranaki on the west coast of the North Island. Shell Todd Oil Services is a business that's owned by Shell Petroleum Mining and Todd Petroleum Mining, who each hold a 50% stake in the company. Now, during those more than 50 years of operation, sir, Shell Todd Oil Services has set incredibly high and stringent operational and environment and safety benchmarks, and they are leaders in the New Zealand oil and gas industry. What this bill does, sir, is it means that the marine consent, which has subsequently been granted by the EPA since the introduction of this bill, will allow them to continue operating beyond June 27th of this year. Now, that wasn't the case when the bill was first introduced, and had we not passed this legislation prior to the end of the month, then the simple reality is that production would have needed to cease on the site, and up to 20%, maybe it's more than 20% of our energy needs as a nation would have been put at risk. So now that the application has been in fact granted, there is still a requirement for this legislation to pass before the 27th of the month in order to cover a situation should there be any appeal lodged to the provision of that consent having been issued. And so this is why this legislation is still required. Dr. Megan Woods, in her speech just a few minutes ago, Mr. Speaker, made mention of the work done at Select Committee. And I want to also, as Chair of the Committee, acknowledge the work done by committee members and also acknowledge with grateful thanks the 5 submitters who presented on the bill, because they did make good points. And this was an example, Mr. Speaker, of a Select Committee working as it should to ensure that a better outcome occurs. And the Local Government and Environment Committee examined the bill very carefully, and we examined the amendments that had been put before us, and then we listened carefully to the points that the submitters made. The net result of that deliberation, sir, was that an amending Clause 4 was recommended by the committee, and that would provide for a new section 1625 to specify that the existing petroleum operators must lodge a marine consent application and have it fully accepted by the Environmental Protection Authority at least 9 months before either the expiry of their permit or their privilege to extract gas or oil. Now, we did consider a number of alternatives to the 9-month time frame. We looked at 6 months, we looked at 9, we looked at 12 months, and each option was considered by the committee. We eventually settled on 9 months as, I think, a reasonable compromise. In a second reading speech, my colleague Todd Muller, the Deputy Chair of the committee, made the point, Mr. Speaker, that any corporate employee worth his or her salt would simply never allow a situation to arise where their ability to trade and to operate their business was put in jeopardy by not having their consent in place and in full prior to that privilege or permit expiring. So I think he made a good point when he raised that matter, and so we've stuck is probably not the right word to say. We've included as part of this legislation now a clause that ensures that it's codified, that there is a 9-month window, and that businesses operating in the area must have that done before the 9 months is up. We further looked, Mr. Speaker, at amending Clause 4 to include a further change to Section 1625 to clarify that those existing mining activities would need to have the applications filed 9 months before the work or their privilege came to an end, but that it must be in filing acceptable. It must be in a format that was acceptable and accepted as in full by the Environmental Protection Agency. Sir, I think those changes made at Select Committee were in fact very good changes. They were common sense, sensible changes, and the committee acted, I think, in a very prudent and diligent way. We worked well together. As I said, sir, Shell Todd has actually now been granted their permit to continue production, but there is still a chance that there may be an appeal, and that's why this bill is important. We simply couldn't find ourselves or put ourselves as a nation in a position where up to 20% of New Zealand's current gas supply would be uncertain in any way. And so this bill won't change anything for existing operators other than to allow Shell Todd Oil Services to continue production pending any appeal that may yet be lodged. It's a good piece of legislation. It's a good piece of legislation to amend an even better Principal Act, and it has, I think, good support across the House, and I think that it will be an example of how this legislature works collaboratively and congenially to achieve good outcomes for the country. It's a good bill, sir, and I commend it to the House.
I call Stuart Nash.